All right. Hello, ladies. Back again. And this time we're going to continue with the theory about memes. Remember, memes are ideas. Ideas that get implanted into the human brain and passed down from person to person. And memes, just like ideas, are the fabric of human culture. They're the DNA of human culture. If we remember from the last, I think it's 2 videos. Now keep that in mind as we go forward. This chapter is the village of the sorcerers and the riddle of control. All diseases of Christians are to be ascribed to demons. St. Augustine. Why humans are drawn to ideas like filings to a magnet. Why do memes have the power to create, elevate, pacify, and kill? One answer is a Rube Goldberg machine built into the human frame, a physiological widget with some rather remarkable tricks. The Nilgiri Hills of India, shortly before the Europeans came, there lived 4 tribes. One tribe, the Badaga, were farmers. Another, the Kora, were craftsmen. A third, the Tota, were herdsmen. And fourth, the Kurumba, made and raised almost nothing at all. The Badaga, Kora, and Tota, and Kurumba lived together in a delicate harmony, each supplying a vital something to the other, each supplying something that the other 3 needed, and paying for the indispensable products of its neighbors with its own handiwork. But there was one form of merchandise the Badaga, the Kota, and the Tota were willing to pay more for than any of the others. Far more. Sometimes their need for this single good mounted to the level of hysterical panic. Yet to us, this commodity might seem the least essential of them all. After the yearly harvest, the women of the Kota craftspeople fashioned pots and carried them, along with iron hoes, forks, and plowshares forged by their husbands, to the village of the Badaga farmers. There the 2 tribes held a feast. When the celebration was over, the Kota craftspeople left, carrying the gift from the Badaga farmer host, a year's supply of wheat. The Kota craftsmen not only made house goods, they were accomplished musicians. To obtain their meal, they played their tunes at the rituals of their herdsmen neighbors, the Tota. In exchange for the music that soothed the gods, the Tota cattle raisers gave the Kota artist musicians meat from the sacrifice of a buffalo. So the Kota lived a cozy economic interdependence with the Tota livestock breeders and the Badaga farmers, swapping handicrafts and music for steaks and bread. But of all 4 tribes, the one with the greatest economic power was the Kurumba. Living in the jungle, the Kurumba did not raise wheat, did not make household utensils, and did not provide meat. They never even set forth to sell their wares. Yet the work they offered brought the Kota craft folk trekking through the dense foliage to the Kurumba village, begging for a service that was totally intangible, one whose value cannot be proven to exist. The Kurumba were sorcerers. The Kota utensil makers paid regular insurance to these forest magicians. After all, the Kurumba spell weavers controlled the dark forces that could snatch you in the middle of the night and bring you down with dropsy, epilepsy, or sleeping sickness, says Melville J. Herskovitz in his classic book Economic Anthropology. The Kurumba The Kurumba exacted all the market would bear, and on occasion their demands were anything but modest. When a Kota fell ill, for example, his relatives indicating how they had been regular and generous in sending gifts to their Kurumba workers of magic, would complain that he had not fulfilled his part of the agreement to keep them from harm. The customary reply would be that some especially powerful Kurumba sorcerer had been insulted by a Kota, or had become envious of their good fortune, and was therefore sending unusual strong magic against his victim. Only sustained effort to be called forth by the giving of extra gifts might counteract this influence, and since there was no other recourse, the Kota would have to give more and more lavishly. Since nature endows the body with vast arsenals for self-defense, the majority of the Kurumba necromancers' clients recovered. Occasionally, however, one succumbed. When a relative died, did the furious Kota artisan family ask for their money back? Did they complain that the sorcery of their jungle neighbors was a fraud? Far from it. The Kurumba protector would be offered sympathy for having to have grappled with so powerful an adversary. The members of the Kota tribe did not know that their Kurumba spellmakers provided them with about as much protection against the evil spirits as Kmart Superman costume would offer against a drive-by shooter's bullets. They clung to the belief that their medical protectors with a passion that went far beyond the borders of reason. But why? The Kota tribesmen's illness and death were forces they could not touch, manipulate, slow down, or shoo away. The sorcerers sold the notion that through their intercession, mere mortals could stop the unstoppable, bring death to heel like a well-trained dog. They offered a fantasy that is more important to us than the reality of our daily bread, an illusion that actually could make the difference between life and death. It is the illusion of control. Control is extremely powerful stuff. Pioneering anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, researching the Trobriand Islanders in 1914 to 1918, demonstrated that these South Sea fishermen used ritual to generate a false sense of mastery when they were about to set out on a deep sea expedition. Highly unpredictable ventures in which finding Ray was more a matter of luck than skill, and the chances of being lost in a storm were great. On the other hand, the islanders didn't bother with the mumbo jumbo when harvesting sea life in their predictable lagoons. Ritual, Malinowski concluded, was a means of creating a false sense of control when reality was intolerably slippery. In his 1927, The Failure of an Illusion, Sigmund Freud went a step further and declared that man will cling to religion's fantasy of control as long as science fails to give him an actual power over his destiny. But the extent to which the need for control is sketched into our biology did not become apparent until roughly 40 years later, when it was discovered that that lab animals who are given control live longer, have higher antibody counts, and fewer ulcers. Jay Weiss at New York's Rockefeller University put two groups of rats in cages with electrically wired floors. When the current was turned on, the rats' unprotected pink feet would receive a painful shock. One group of rats could neither stop nor escape the onset of the electrical charge. A second group was granted a modest privilege. The cages were outfitted with a switch that would allow these rodents to turn off the electricity. The group with the switch, in short, had control. The rats who had been able to control their punishment emerged from the experiment in relative health. despite the heavy dose of electrical torment. But the group that had no control came out of their ordeal with a high incidence of stomach ulcers. The difference occurred despite the fact that the two groups of rats received precisely the same amount of electrical shot at precisely at the same time. What's more, in similar studies in the University of Colorado, after only a short exposure to uncontrollable pain, the immune defenses of the helpless rats crumbled, leaving the creatures highly vulnerable to infection and to cancer-causing drugs. Control protected the health of the rats with the switch, and the lack of control stripped their hapless brethren of even their own internal protectors. Numerous additional experiments have confirmed control's benefits to physical health. Control is also the magic ingredient that keeps us alert in the face of danger. It does so by suppressing the output of endorphins. Endorphins are chemicals produced by the body to soothe our pain. They are similar in molecular construction to morphine, and they have morphine's ability to smother suffering. Endorphins have been glorified in popular literature as blessed biological benefactors. In reality, they are seductive poisons. Endorphins' power to anesthetize is great, but they cripple us in the bargain, shutting our receptors and cutting our resistance to disease. Two groups of rats were placed in shock cages. One group could escape the shock by jumping into an unelectrified platform. A second group could not. In short, the rats that could make the leap had a primitive form of control. The systems of rats who could not control their shock were flooded with endorphins. The rats who did have control, on the other hand, avoided a endorphin surge. The rats without control were affected with endorphins, dulling of their senses and the mind. The rats with a handle on the fate remained perceptive and alert. Other experiments indicate something equally ominous. The lack of control disables the ability for a long-term potentiation of neurons. In other words, it wreaks havoc on the ability to retain and act on vital information. And we're always told that certain things are good, like endorphins are good, but there's always a trade-off, is there not? Control in humans and in rats energizes the mind. A lack of control cripples mental powers. Lack of control makes people give up. Two groups of human subjects were given a set of complicated puzzles and proofreading chore. Both groups had to carry out their task while an irritating noise grated away in the background. There was one major difference between the two experimental contingents. One had control and one did not. The tables at which one group of subjects had a button. With that button, they could turn off the wretched sound. The second group members had no control at all. Without a button, they simply had to grin and bear it. The group with control buttons on their desks sailed through puzzles and made only a modest number of errors in their proofreading. The group with no control did miserably. They mastered 5 times fewer puzzles, and their proofreading was atrocious. The deprivation of control had clouded their minds. Strangest of all, the group with the button never actually pushed that button once. It wasn't the noise or lack of it that affected their performance. It was the mere idea that if they wanted to, they could shut it off. The thought was of control. It was the thought of control. Dakota came crawling to their sorcerer neighbors, begging for an invisible form of help, because forests, which doctors sold the impression that Through their services, men could hold their fingers above the unseen button that turns off death and disease. This belief in magic is one clue for our need for memes. Religious and scientific schemes, clusters of guesswork that sometimes seem like a madman's dreams, offer the feeling of control, an indispensable fuel for physiological powerhouses of life. The modern medical shaman. How silly these backward Coda villagers were, you may very well say. The strange nonsense preyed on the primitive minds. How fortunate we are in our great modern age. Few of us are this gullible. But are we? But we are. Like the Kurumba sorcerers, modern doctors sell the illusion of control. Often when you describe your symptoms to an MD, he gives you an indifferent look, as if no such problem exists. You are not the only one your doctor treats this way. Norman Cousins, in Human Opinions, described a case which he considered all too typical. One in which the hospital staff was contented with a half-truth. The investigation of the patient was decidedly unscientific in that it stopped short of even an attempt to determine the real cause of the symptoms. As soon as organic disease could be excluded, the whole problem was given up. But the symptoms persisted. The case was a medical failure in note of the fact that the patient went home with the assurance that there was nothing the matter with her. According to the National Center for Health Statistics, Americans make 600 million office visits per year. Doctors conclude that the patient in over half of these cases have no real problem. Why would a man selling his ability to deal with disease pretend that your affliction is some contemptible whim? After all, the symptoms one generation swears are in your head are often shown by research to be real a few decades later. But a doctor does not generally confess ignorance. He is selling the illusion of omnipotence, the illusion that through consulting him you can gain control over your body. The same illusion sold by the sorcerers of India. Where do we hear that about the medical profession? They are not omnipotent. Occasionally, your physician changes tactics. He gives you a name for your problem, but no cure. The name alone, like a magic talisman, makes you feel you have a problem your doctor can't control. Or the doctor gives you a prescription. Often it's simply for an anti-inflammatory drug. An imitation aspirin. In most cases, an anti-inflammatory agent will not cure you, but it may provide momentary relief from a symptom, and it could produce the placebo effect, another benefit of the illusion of control. The doctor may send you to the hospital for tests, but try asking him what treatments are available once the tests are over. In many cases, there are none, or at most one or two. The tests and the elaborate equipment used to administer them are frequently part of a show designed to enhance the illusion of a vast technology providing the doctor with control. Take, for example, one of the current age's most common affliction, the back problem. If you come down with back pain and are sent tests, you can have micrograms, x-rays, CAT scans, or nuclear magnetic resonance scans. But ask first what the doctor can do to treat you when the tests are over. The range of remedies include laminectomy, surgical removal of a disc, after which the two vertebrae are generally fused, an anti-inflammatory drug, a physician, psychiatrist, physiotherapy, or the injection of a papin. Will the test results influence the doctor's choice or cure? Generally not. So why the test? to cover the doctor against potential malpractice claims and to sell the illusion of control. Medical science has made massive progress since the days of leeches and bleedings, but it is still hapless in the face of many of mankind's ailments. In fact, there is a good chance that the doctor's art has far less to do with the advance of modern health than any of us would like to think. Several medical authors in 1987 and 1988 produced illuminating historical critiques of mortality statistics. These analyses demonstrated a puzzling fact that mankind's lengthening lifespan owes less than we might imagine to modern drugs. To modern drugs, diagnostic techniques, surgery, hospitals, and any other tools of contemporary health care. The investigators pointed out that the devastating illness like typhoid, cholera, measles, smallpox, and tuberculosis began their decline in the mid-1800s. Over time, these sicknesses dwindled down to a fraction of their previous levels. The wonder drugs usually credited with eradicating the diseases, antibiotics, were not invented until nearly 100 years after the diseases started to disappear. Tuberculosis, for example, decreased by a startling 97% from 1800 to 1945. Only then was the streptomycin finally introduced to mop up the meager fraction still remaining. Apparently, it was not just the set of bottles in the doctor's bag or the miraculous pills dispensed by prescriptions that destroyed the deadly scourge. Exactly what did produce the dramatic increase in contemporary health still eludes experts. It was actually just sanitation, believe it or not. Mere sanitation of, most of the stuff is waterborne and airborne. If you clear up the food and the water and the environments with feces that used to have feces and all kind of stuff, guess what happened? Most of the diseases that they cause will disappear. Some say it was the improvement in nutrition, the introduction of clean water supplies, and the improvement of sanitation. Exactly. Others, like the California epidemiologist Leonard A. Saugan, said that greater freedom, hence degree of control, which became available to the average citizen. Maybe it's not so surprising that the vast variety of symptoms which afflict mankind puzzle even the most erudite doctor. Over 50% of the patients who troop into medical offices are sent home with the assurance that there's nothing really wrong. Even well-understood illnesses are far less controllable by medical techniques than physicians are willing to admit. How does the medical profession deal with this dilemma? It hides its ignorance. According to a 1987 study by psychologist Dan Baron of Israel's Ben Gurion University, 40 patients are usually better able to predict the impact of their malady than their doctors. That's probably true because it's your body. What doctors are selling, then it's not necessarily the ability to cure us, it's the illusion of control. While medical practitioners make their living from the human hunger for control, they are also frequently victims of that hunger. Like their patients, doctors need desperately to believe that they indeed can dominate the forces of disease and healing. Psychological research suggests that people tend to block out what they can't control and focus on what they can. The medical profession's eyes are frequently blinded by this phenomenon. One good example of the medical community's former refusal to acknowledge the existence of adolescent depression. Frederick K. Goodwin, scientific director of the National Institute of Mental Health, explains that the psychotherapeutic community only recognized the existence of severe depression in teenagers and children in the mid-70s, says Goodwin. Until maybe 10 years ago, we believed that severe depression was solely an illness of adults. Adolescents didn't develop real depression. They just had adolescent adjustment problems. So psychiatrists didn't and still don't think to look for this in kids. However, we know that this idea is dead wrong. In the 50s or 60s, you may have had a 14-year-old who couldn't sleep, who'd stop eating, and who was spending a good deal of his or her time weeping, who may have been a good student, bright, cheerful, and sociable, but now seemed cut off from other people. If you'd taken that child to a psychiatrist or psychologist, the doctor would have almost certainly have dismissed the symptoms as merely a phase. Meanwhile, in 1951, medical researchers developed a new drug, apromazid, to treat tuberculosis. When the substance produced strange side effects, making patients euphoric and unusually energetic, it was slated for the medical trash can. Then in 1957, a few psychiatrists discovered the apromazid could be used to relieve depression in patients who hadn't responded to any other form of therapy. But it wasn't until the 70s when the use of these miraculous new pills spread throughout the medical community. When antidepressant began to spill from pharmaceutical factories, a phenomenon which hadn't existed in the minds of doctors emerged from the shadows of the denial. The physician was suddenly willing to see a set of symptoms which a few years earlier had airily been dismissed. Today, the good doctor sagely pronounces the diagnosis he's picked up from the medical journals, and he centers his pen over his pad to jot a prescription. One old expression says, a man whose only tool is a hammer analyzes every problem in terms of nails. Without the hammer of antidepressants, the doctor once denied the existence of adolescent depression. Now the physician has a tool which provides control. He is ready to open his eyes. The doctor, it seems, craves control as deeply as his patient. What did I say about worldview? When a man's only tool is a hammer, he analyzes every problem in terms of nails. So when they came out with a pill and it was approved, guess what they saw? You only see or believe what's in your worldview, which is one thing they're trying to say. And the ideas, your brain filters out ideas. It filters out ideas. And it filters out conclusions. So if your worldview won't accept it, and I've seen that many times, if your worldview will not accept an idea or a solution, it won't accept it, and it can't get through. And he's just going into detail about memes and how memes and ideas and culture affect what problems you see as important or problems you see as not important, how you can ignore facts because your culture and your worldview will not recognize it. It just can't. It can't penetrate it. And I see that happens a lot with my subs. If it's an idea that they just can't wrap their heads around, okay, it's not that because they're stupid. It's because their worldview will not accept it. In fact, if you listen to our hangout, you hear that a lot with Classic Ruby. It's not that she's stupid. She's very smart. The thing is her worldview blocks certain things. So she will fight to death to not accept what I say or what other men say because it's not in her worldview. She refuses. But that's human. All humans do it. I do the same thing. Until my worldview changes, there's things that I couldn't accept. And I had to slowly change it over time. Now my worldview is more open. And sometimes even then I don't accept certain things until I keep seeing it over and over again. The thing is that I will accept it over time. Sometimes I hear something off the cuff. I will not. But that's all humans. That's something to keep in mind. This chapter is going to be very, very important. Like I said, this is the one chapter. If you don't learn anything else from the Lucifer principle, this is actual gold. But with that, I'm going to cut out. This is BGS out, and I'll see you on the next one.